Welcome to the Technology Serving Humanity podcast from the FedEx Institute of Technology at the University of Memphis. In this series, we explore how innovation shapes and is shaped by our shared human experience. Through conversations with thought leaders, scholars, and changemakers, we look beyond the technology itself to examine its social, political, and philosophical impact on individuals and communities. Thank you for joining us as we explore how technology can serve not just progress, but people.
And I'm Amanda Gajoli. I'm a faculty in history, and it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gregg Mitman, who's visiting here with us today. Dr. Gregg Mitman is professor at Ludwig, Maximilian University's Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich, Germany. So it's a long journey to get here. And he is also William Coleman Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and professor of history, medical history, and environmental studies there. So Professor Mitman is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and teacher whose work spans environmental history, the history of science, medical history, and the visual culture of science and medicine, with a focus on the United States and the world. His research explores how political economy, cultural values, and scientific knowledge intersect to shape human-environment interactions over time, and he is deeply committed to environmental and social justice. Over the last decade, Mitman has focused on a multimedia project exploring the history and legacy of the Firestone Plantations Company in Liberia. He co-produced and co-directed 2 films, In the Shadow of Ebola, an intimate portrait of the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, and The Land Beneath Our Feet, a documentary on history, memory, and land rights. His most recent book, Empire and Rubber, Firestone's Scramble for Land and Power in Liberia, published in 2021, was named one of Bloomberg's best books of the fall and praised by Publishers Weekly as, quote, a harrowing and richly detailed account of U.S. corporate exploitation, environmental devastation, and resistance in Liberia. Mitman's current research, Fragments of the Forest, is supported by a European Research Council advanced grant, and it examines the ecological, economic, political, and social forces that have shaped fragments of the upper Guinean rainforest into hotspots of biodiversity, emerging infectious disease, and resource extraction. He has received numerous fellowships, has served as president of the American Society for Environmental History, and was recently awarded by the Republic of Liberia for his decades of justice-driven scholarship and global health advocacy. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Gregg Mitman, who will present Ebola in a Stew of Fear.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks to Amanda for inviting me here. It's my first time at this. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for those who come to the talk today. This talk is part of It's part of the ERC project that Amanda mentioned called Fragments of the Forest, Hot Zones, Disease Ecology, and the Changing Landscape of Health and Environment in West Africa, that we are in the 4th year. It's a 5-year project of. And it's an interdisciplinary group of us working together. And I want to recognize everybody on the team. To the left is Musa Duno, Shadrach Kawilian, Emanuela Roth, myself, and John Fay. It's very much in the spirit, I know, of what the kind of conversations that are happening here about thinking about environmental humanities. Musa is trained as a physician and medical anthropologist. Emma is trained as a social anthropologist. Shadrach is trained as a conservation biologist, and John is trained as a molecular biologist. So it's a quite interdisciplinary group in which we've come together to really try and understand the economic, political, social, and environmental forces that have turned the upper Guinean forests of West Africa, which extend from Sierra Leone to Nigeria, into a so-called hotspot of biodiversity, of emerging infectious disease threats, and of resource extraction. And my part, everybody has different parts of the project. My part of the project is one part of it, anyways, is a book I'm working on that'll be published by Princeton University Press. Right now it's called Bloodborne, Chasing Ecologies and Power Across Viral Divides. And in this book, I'm trying to take readers across time and place and to try and understand how a century of scientific research hunting for the origins of viruses in the Guinean forests of West Africa transformed the relationships among people, wildlife, and places in one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. Bloodborne reveals how a new form of life, the virus, became known, how ecological understandings of viral infectious diseases took root, how new alliances among living things were made, and how health inequalities arising from such research endure. And so the book looks at 3 viruses over a 100-year time span, yellow fever, hepatitis B, and Ebola. And today I want to talk a bit about Ebola. And to start, so we'll start. Bushmeat, I said, wondering. Our film crew had gathered for a communal meal under a thatched roof, open-air kitchen in a Liberian village near the Guinea border. The cassava and pepper stew our hosts offered smelled delicious. It was June of 2014. Hanging in the air with the scent of pepper soup was an indefinite fear of a simmering Ebola outbreak. The mention of wild meat caught my attention. Was it fruit bat or chimpanzee? Both are suspected harbors of the Ebola virus. As I was planning this Liberian trip in March, the international media was mostly quiet about the slow burn of Ebola affecting Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Through personal contacts and Liberian news sources, I followed a smattering of concerning reports. As I left for Liberia in late May, information about the Ebola eruption was still spotty in the Western press and on government websites. Ebola virus disease was first described in 1976 after an outbreak in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Additional disease outbreaks occurred over the years in several African countries, but the West African epidemic that would boil over in 2014 in West Africa before dying out in 2016 would become the largest in history, causing an estimated 28,652 cases and 11,325 deaths. My host smiled knowingly at my bushmeat question. Even in this remote village, an hour's hike from the nearest road and a two-day drive from the capital city of Monrovia, awareness of active Ebola penetrated the atmosphere. Don't worry, I was assured. I hesitated a moment longer. Surely cooking would have inactivated the virus, and I didn't want to seem unappreciative. Dipping my spoon into the pot, I savored the spicy flavors. I was back home in the US in late July when news broke that 2 American medical missionaries, a white man, Dr. Kent Bratley, and a white woman, Nancy Ritable, had become infected with Ebola while working in Monrovia. As they were airlifted to Emory University a few days later, Ebola was suddenly grabbing global headlines. On August 8th, the World Health Organization declared the West African Ebola outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, which placed the emerging infectious diseases in the same category as bioterrorism and environmental catastrophe. And now, having lived through the COVID pandemic, you know what a public health emergency of international concern is, but at the time, very few people did. When WHO took action, the virus had already killed more than 800 people in 3 countries. Many were West African healthcare workers whose deaths did not elicit an urgent international response. Fear of Ebola, ignited by media attention, exploded, spreading faster than the virus. Quarantine became the watchword as alarm over Ebola's escape from Africa grew. Donald Trump charged the conversation, tweeting, "Stop all flights from Ebola-infected countries, or the plague will start and spread inside our borders." As fear fired suspicion, and scapegoating swirled, disparaging words and discriminatory actions prompted the Liberian diaspora's widespread social media campaign. Racial and geographic stigmatization and unwarranted blame accompany what literary studies scholar Priscilla Lald calls outbreak narratives. This was evident as the COVID-19 pandemic descended. Western news outlets quickly sensationalized Wuhan's wet markets, bustling with people, domestic animals, and wildlife as dangerous so-called hotspots where viruses could spill from animal to human. Outbreak narratives and spillover stories commonly include moral discourses, wherein nature's purity is polluted by matter out of place, as when viruses perturbed by human activity, like Ebola or SARS, which made headlines in 2003 as problems of the other. Such us versus them dichotomies help craft origin stories that stigmatize disease locales like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and disparage ways of being such as bushmeat consumption or wet market customs. More so, the solutions powerful nations propose for problems of the other often rely on particular ecological ideas and resource management practices rooted in the history of colonialism, Western conservation, morality, and politics. So this afternoon, I want to dissect the origin stories that arose during the 2014-16 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, chasing ecologies and power across viral divides. The moral tales put forth to account for the origin and spread of Ebola are, to borrow the words of the late ecologist G. Evelyn Hutchinson, ecological theater and evolutionary plays. Upon examination, these fables wailed contested ecologies of disease, land use, climate change, and species extinction within a shifting milieu of geopolitics, knowledge, and fears. They span geologic, forest, and human timescales, extend from the microcosmic to the global, and star a virus whose replication cycle is measured in hours or days, and whose longevity, whose ability to remain invisible in its host is unknown. So where does an outbreak origin story begin? Perhaps with the patient zero, like Emile Umunu, a toddler living in a Guinean rainforest village. Until he and then family members succumbed, Zaire Ebola virus had not been identified in that part of West Africa. Or perhaps with a hollow ceiba tree that housed a bat colony. Emile allegedly played near the sacred tree before becoming infected. Mysteriously, the tree was destroyed by fire, and its bat residents dispersed shortly before a team of investigative scientists arrived in March 2014. Or might disease origin be a tale of ecosystem management? In this scenario, deforestation, exacerbated by population pressure, war, poverty, subsistence agriculture, and industrial extraction, modifies human-animal contexts as occurs hunting bushmeat. As described by journalist Jeffrey Stern in a 2000 Vanity Fair essay, Hell in the Hot Zone, ecosystem alterations destroy, quote, the buffer separating humans from animals and from the pathogens that animals harbor. Origin stories depict relations. Accounts of the 2014-16 Ebola outbreak link parasite with human host, virus with its suspected wildlife reservoir, village residents with their bat neighbors, human activities with the forest in which they transpire. Each tale offers a different framing of Ebola's ecology. The assorted Ebola outbreak narratives reveal contested histories, politics, meanings, beliefs, fears, values, and rights that have shaped and continue to shape access to the natural resources of the upper Guinean forests of West Africa in a world increasingly threatened by deforestation, zoonotic disease, biodiversity loss, and climate change. As the outbreak unfolded across Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, public health messaging aimed at preventing virus spread warned locals against hunting and consuming wild animals, particularly bats, chimpanzees, and monkeys. The The one on the left is a public health messaging poster from Guinea, the one in the middle from Sierra Leone, and the one on the right from Liberia. As the first deaths from Ebola virus struck the capital city of Monrovia in June 2014, Vice News aimed at bushmeat consumption as a likely outbreak origin, targeting Lufa County, a Liberian bushmeat trading center near the Guinea and Sierra Leone borders. In the video report, the authoritative voice of American virus hunter Joseph Fair, then corporate vice president of Metabiota, a global viral forecasting company, takes viewers to one of Monrovia's markets to assert that the West African bushmeat trade poses spillover risks. Never mind that scientists had not located the strain of the Ebola virus responsible for the outbreak in any local wildlife sample. Human-to-human transmission, not multiple spillovers, spread the Ebola virus. Nevertheless, bushmeat played large in media-fueled outbreak fears. The August 29th Newsweek cover photograph of a chimpanzee with the headline, "A Backdoor for Ebola," hyped a story about smuggled African bushmeat in America. Anthropologist Adia Benton saw the cover as among, quote, old tropes of apes standing in for black folks, end quote, while journalist Howard French saw the Ebola epidemic report as more Ooga Booga writing. The German National Weekly, Die Zeit, traced the outbreak catastrophe to the collision of nature and civilization, concluding that humans invaded the habitat of the virus. And this, for any librarian, I mean, the way in which this image conjures up many international media images of war, civil war in Liberia is quite haunting. The villain in this disease ecology tale was neither the virus nor the bat, but the hunter, the bushmeat trader, the rogue, that in words of anthropologist James Fairhead, was living on the frontier zones and porous borders outside the reach of weak security states. Fears surrounding Ebola during the 2014-16 outbreak were multiple. What writer Mike Davis calls the ecology of fear differed by locale. People living in the hinterlands of the Guinean forest or Liberia's Mount Nimba region feared bans on bushmeat hunting and markets that threatened their livelihoods. People living in the capital cities of Conakry or Monrovia had other fears. For example, residents of Monrovia's West Point neighborhood feared further violent military enforcement of quarantine. Over time, fears can morph or entrench. In Ebola-affected areas, fear directed at an influx of doctors and nurses reflected not simply ignorance and superstition, as Western media claimed, but also the scars and painful memories of past medical encounters. Uninformed Western attitudes associating West Africa's equatorial forest with deadly diseases like malaria and yellow fever were a fear bomb primed for detonation and ignited by a 24/7 news cycle of Ebola and sensationalism. I remember at the time being called by a New York Times reporter because there was a lot of attention played by Western media on quote strange funerary practices in Liberia where people felt the need to wash the bodies of deceased. And I said, well, there's nothing like culturally exotic about that. When my father passed, my mother and I felt very compelled to wash his body, but there was this kind of real portrayal of these as some kind of exotic practices. Fear can be a tool. Animal rights activists and wildlife conservationists saw advantage in anxieties surrounding bushmeat. Writing in The New Scientist, Tennyson Williams, Africa Regional Director for the World Society Protection of Animals, saw a, quote, silver lining in Ebola, a chance, in his words, to clamp down on a practice which both causes disease outbreaks and empties forests of wildlife. Robert Young, a professor of wildlife conservation, sounded an even more dire alarm in the conversation. I quote, if humans continue to increase the items on their bushmeat menu, then we can expect more diseases like Ebola and HIV to appear. Now, somebody who lives in Wisconsin, where hunting deer is a big thing, it's very interesting that we don't call deer bushmeat, right? Call it wild game. But when it comes from Africa, it's bushmeat. Others, including a team of Imperial College conservation biologists, warned against using the Ebola epidemic as a Trojan horse to achieve wildlife conservation ends. Doing so, they cautioned, and I quote, raises unfortunate associations with a long history of an outdated discourse of conservation in Africa that favored wildlife over people. Bushmeat bans imposed by the governments of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone during the outbreak eroded public health's greatest tool, and that is trust. Such bans contradicted generations of embodied knowledge and experience hunting and consuming wild meat in the upper Guinean forests of West Africa. Endemic trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, has historically prevented livestock cultivation in the region, making wild meat an important protein source. Bushmeat also prevents food insecurity when drought, pestilence, or flooding cause crop failure. Public health messaging that targeted eating bushmeat undermined the credibility of government and foreign NGO messengers and pushed the trade underground. Bans and alarming messages also severely impacted lives and livelihoods, contributing to food and economic insecurity in the region. In Guinea, an estimated 1 million pounds was lost in bushmeat sales, and 100,000 people lost work. It would not be the first time that global concerns about zoonotic disease threats were used as a powerful weapon by Western NGOs to stigmatize forest use practices among local people in West Africa in the name of biodiversity conservation. And just to bring up an example, in the early 1990s, the dangers of emerging viruses underscored by the appearance of HIV/AIDS, Ebola, Marburg, and other novel pathogens aroused alarm among scientists and the public. Like Homo sapiens, viruses and other microorganisms were responding to a rapidly changing world, where forest degradation, species extinction, urbanization, war, migration, and factory farming were altering life. In his 1994 best-selling book, The Hot Zone, Terrifying True Story, Richard Preston accentuated fears that a growing human population in closer and more frequent contact with diverse life forms in the tropics would allow a deadly virus to jump the species divide to humans. By 1998, evidence of such a spillover and a resultant widespread epidemic made the cover of Nature. A team led by Beatrice Hahn at the University of Alabama used phylogenetic DNA analysis to posit that the HIV-1 virus, the main cause of AIDS, came to humans by way of chimpanzees in West Africa. Further, Hahn's group identified that it was the West African hunting practice of killing chimps for food as the zoonotic transmission doorway. Their finding was based on conversations with Karl Mann, a Swiss wildlife photographer and conservationist who led a concerted and sensationalized campaign against logging and the bushmeat trade in Africa. This is one popular books he published with Dale Peterson. Recently, this so-called cut hunter hypothesis, which you might know of as it was popularized by David Palman in some of his books, this so-called cut hunter hypothesis for the origins of HIV/AIDS was challenged by a group of anthropologists, historians, and virologists. Their 2021 book, The Histories of HIVs, convincingly rejects accounts of a single spillover event as the origin of HIV/AIDS. Rather, they argue multiple historical processes, ecological and geographical, economic and political, social and medical, enabled the virus to move from its simian reservoir, evolve, and spread among humans. The cut hunter notion was, however, a convenient argument for primate conservation. As Amin wrote in a pitch to National Geographic, and I quote, "I am today convinced that the virus angle is our last and best hope to turn the bushmeat issue into a crisis scenario as far as the public in the West is concerned." 7 years later, in 2005, virus hunter Nathan Wolfe, conservationist biologist Peter Daszak, and others marshaled further evidence in an influential paper to promote the links between zoonotic disease outbreaks, including HIV/AIDS, and anthropogenic drivers such as bushmeat hunting and logging in West and Central Africa. In biodiversity-rich regions, such as the Guinean forests of West Africa, viruses were known to jump from wildlife reservoirs to humans. This is the Guinean forest. But such one-off infections rarely resulted in human-to-human transmission. An increase in habitat fragmentation and human-wildlife interactions, they reasoned, also increased the likelihood of a human-adapted virus spreading through new viral traffic routes, for example, along logging roads that linked remote forest regions to urban centers. Wolfe, Daszak, and their co-authors ended the paper with a bold claim. And I quote, "It is now becoming possible to conduct the science of predicting emerging zoonoses." Wolfe capitalized on the markability of these insights, working the TED Talk circuit, tramping through Cameroon forests, seeking bushmeat hunters and viruses, accompanied by CNN commentator Anderson Cooper, and founding the fundraising juggernaut Metabiota in 2008. By 2015, Metabiota had raised $30 million from investment firms specializing in data analytics, healthcare, and high tech. All bought Wolfe's claim that virus hunting, coupled with metadata analysis and computer modeling, would predict where the next epidemic might erupt. Yet the company was widely criticized by WHO, Médecins Sans Frontières, and investigative journalists for bungling its response to the 2014-16 Ebola outbreak. Allegations included misdiagnosing samples and misreading the trajectory of the epidemic in Sierra Leone. Through conservation organizations like the Wildlife Trust, Wildlife Conservation Society, and EcoHealth Alliance, institutions critical to the formulation of the concept of One Health. Daszak proselytized the need to, quote, stress the zoonotic connections between human health and the emergence of diseases in wildlife, particularly in regions like the Guinean forests of West Africa, which in the early 2000s became identified as both a, quote, hotspot of biodiversity and emerging infectious disease threats. In 2008, he jointly authored a letter in Nature that attempted to bring empirical evidence to his prophetic claims and significantly impacted the direction of U.S. federal policy and funding for researching pandemic preparedness. The authors analyzed data from more than 300 emerging infectious disease events that occurred between 1940 and 2004. Event occurrences were correlated with socioeconomic, environmental, and ecological factors. Human population density and growth, rainfall and species richness, and changes in land use, industrial agriculture, and bushmeat hunting were all factored in. Approximately 60% of emerging disease events were associated with zoonoses, the majority of which originated in wildlife. The highest concentration occurred in high-latitude developed countries, where the group argued human population density and antibiotic drug use and industrial agriculture were major contributing factors. And I just want to emphasize again, the highest concentration occurred in high-latitude developed countries. But more robust disease surveillance in developed countries, the authors claim, resulted in spatial reporting bias. And this is the most cited paper on emerging infectious disease hotspots, and it's also one of the most criticized, which also makes it one of the most cited. But factoring out such bias, they determined that low latitude, biodiversity-rich tropical rainforest regions in Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia were the highest risk hotspots for zoonosis and posed the greatest threats to global health. Hotspots of emerging infectious diseases map closely with hotspots of biodiversity. The overlap signified regions at high risk for zoonotic spillover and species extinction. Protecting high biodiversity areas, Daszak hypothesized, reduced, quote, the likelihood of future zoonotic disease emergence. He and his collaborators urged a reallocation of resources for what they termed smart surveillance of emerging disease hotspots in tropical forest regions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Surveillance, they proclaimed, would identify potential zoonotic spillovers before they spread. In 2019, the United States Agency for International Development, which is now no longer in existence, acting on what Wolf, Daszak, and other scientists had been preaching for a decade, launched PREDICT. Over 10 years, the program spent more than $200 million furthering research, strengthening surveillance, and increasing laboratory capacity, all aimed at discovering and detecting zoonotic pathogens at the human-wildlife interface. PREDICT targeted places such as West Africa, as seen as a biodiversity hotspot and an emerging infectious disease threat, where public health infrastructure and disease surveillance was underfunded and severely limited. More than 6,000 researchers in 30 developing countries were trained and engaged, unearthing an estimated 1,100 new viruses. But it all proved impotent to prevent what would become the largest Ebola outbreak in human history, and also COVID-19. As Ebola origin stories featuring spillovers and bushmeat captivated Western media and some conservation biologists, an evolutionary epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota, Robert Wallace, and a professor of wildlife health and emerging diseases at the Royal Veterinary College, Richard Koch, looked elsewhere to account for the spread of Ebola virus, into the political ecology of industrial oil palm plantations spreading across West Africa. Wallace and Koch found the spillover story involving a bat and a boy to be problematic. In 2006, researchers at the Kenema Government Hospital Lhasa Diagnostic Laboratory in Sierra Leone found antibodies to the Ebola virus in human blood. And so that's an indication of previous infection, that the Zaire Ebola virus existed in Sierra Leone long before the outbreak. Furthermore, as Liberian Minister of Health Bernice Dawn discovered, German researchers had detected Ebola antibodies as early as 1981 in blood samples taken in 1973 from workers on Liberia's rubber and iron ore concessions. So Ebola was not as new or rare in West Africa as spillover origin stories implied. In West Africa, farmers practiced traditional slash-and-burn agriculture. They clear a patch of forest, burn the felled trees to release nutrients, and then plant rice, cassava, and other staples and cash crops. When the soil is depleted, that patch is left to lay fallow for 15 to 20 years, and a new patch is open for planting. The temporal and spatial dynamics of such a system, Wallace and his collaborators suggested, acted as a kind of friction to a pathogen's evolution and spread. Before the Ebola outbreak began in Meliandou, nearby expansion of oil palm production had cleared 80% of forest cover. This isn't in Sierra Leone. It's a oil palm plantation in Liberia where we've done some work. It's 500,000 acres of single monoculture oil palm. So it's hard to imagine the scale of this, but when you're in there, you can easily get lost because there's no bearings. The large-scale clear-cutting for oil palm, according to Wallace and colleagues, and I quote, may have lowered the ecosystem temperature by which Ebola can be sterilized and controlled. In this narrative, a viral pathogen previously confined as sporadic fevers in isolated areas finds opportunity to incubate and spread. So what they were basically arguing, or what they argue, is that slash and burn agriculture, because of its very patchy dynamics, acted as a kind of friction or from the virus's evolution and spread. But when you get a large plantation like this, it provides much less kind of resistance. Spillover origin stories too often rely upon absolute geographies. The place of pathogen emergence thus becomes the site of causality and blame. Yet in this highly connected, interdependent, globalized world, no place is local. Global circuits of capital touch down in places like Meliandu, transform traditional agricultural systems, alter patterns of human and animal migration, and drive new alliances among living things. Wallace provocatively argues that falling commodities and diseases as capital reshapes life potentially reverses causality. Not the virus, but capital is the culprit. This view turns not West Africa, but, quote, New York, London, and Hong Kong, key centers of global capital, into three of the world's worst hotspots instead. So now I'm going to switch to yet another kind of origin story ecology affair. At the height of the Ebola outbreak in October 2014, as people in Monrovia and in rural villages succumbed to the virus, the multinational company Bridgestone Firestone seized on tragedy to extol its presence in Liberia and to pitch yet another spin on the outbreak: the success of neoliberal approaches to global health and development. Firestone did what governments have not: heralded international media headlines. Capital in this tale was the savior. Through a coordinated system of isolation wards, quarantine centers, and epidemiological surveillance, Firestone had just 3 Ebola cases on its 185 square mile rubber plantation. A few weeks after President Obama pledged U.S. aid to Liberia, CDC investigator Dr. Brandon Flannery was asked what was needed. He replied, more Firestones. But neither NPR, which broke the story, nor Brandon discussed Firestone's complicity in creating Liberia's fragmented and frail healthcare landscape. Spotty and inadequate public health and medical infrastructures contributed to the Ebola deaths of thousands of Liberians, including contract Firestone workers who could not access company medical care and thus weren't in its statistics. The uneven dynamics of Liberia's beleaguered healthcare landscape, as well as its fragmented forests, were rooted in a plantation economy built on parasitic relations of exchange. In 1926, Firestone secured from the Liberian government a 99-year lease for up to 1 million acres of land to grow rubber. To use a Liberian idiom, Firestone plated the mat for the wave of land concessions that would follow. By the 1950s, under President William Tubman's open door policy, the country had become a patchwork of rubber and iron ore concessions. This is a map of current concessions in Liberia, which take up more than 50% of land. And many of these concessions are given to foreign corporations for growing oil palm, for growing rubber. They take away customary land. And many of these leases last from anywhere from 63 to 100 years. So you're really, mortgaging future generations through these. Foreign corporations, including Firestone, the Liberian-American-Swedish mining company Lamco, and the German-directed Mong Mining Company, were the primary drivers and investors in biomedical research and clinical care in Liberia in the post-World War II period. The promise of free medical care attracted able-bodied men and women as laborers to the plantations and mines, and won the support of Liberian elites, who were also afforded treatment. The blood, tumors, and parasites of concession workers, harvested by American, German, and Swedish researchers, were yet another resource upon which professional careers and commercial profits largely benefiting Western scientists and pharmaceutical companies, were made. Little attention was paid by multinationals to building clinical and research capacity within Liberia. As a result, concessions became healthcare oases in what the late Paul Farmer described as the clinical desert of West Africa. So if you were a paid salary employee on Firestone or at Lamco, you got free medical care. And there was a medical treatment center hospital built in these company concessions. But if you lived outside the concession, your access to healthcare was extremely, extremely limited. The accumulating tinder of inequality, oppression, and resentment spawned by Liberia's extractive economy, which had made fortunes for both foreign multinationals and a comprador Liberian class, became incendiary. Beginning in 1989, civil war tore the nation apart, impelled a mass exodus of educated Liberian professionals, and decimated the country's infrastructure. When the Ebola outbreak erupted, only a decade after peace returned to the country, Liberia had fewer than 200 doctors to serve 4 million people. The Liberian government's initial response to the Ebola outbreak included roadblocks and barricades secured by armed military and police. It rekindled the trauma of war. In West Point, Monrovia's largest and poorest slum, the August 2014 declaration of a state of emergency, accompanied by a gun-backed government cordon sanitaire, sparked confusion and riots. A teenage boy, Shaki Kamara, was tragically killed when police sprayed bullets into a crowd that had gathered to protest restrictions. In disenfranchised communities like West Point, food insecurity, dead bodies, state-sanctioned violence, and chaos plagued Liberians fighting what Emmanuel Yuri Yapawolo and others described as an invisible war. In 2014, Time magazine named Liberia's Musaka Fala an Ebola Fighter Person of the Year. Fala gained the recognition in part for recognizing the ecology of fear contributing to human transmission of Ebola virus. Born into West Point's poverty, Fala was raised in a one-room home. As a child, he collected empty bottles on the beach to get money for the day's meal. The trauma of guns, violence, and civil war were part of his upbringing. Education became an escape route that led him to a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Kentucky and additional training in infectious diseases and global health at Harvard. In 2014, Fala was working for Liberia's Ministry of Health, overseeing disease surveillance, contact tracing, case management, and community mobilization for the county where Monrovia is located. When Ebola cases appeared in West Point, fearless residents stormed and looted a makeshift holding center for infected patients. The unrest prompted the quarantine and its violent enforcement when resistance arose. Fala let the community of his childhood show to him how to combat the outbreak of the virus and the fear surrounding it. Crossing the military barricade each day put Fala in harm's way, but allowed him to meet with community leaders and gain their respect. He and his staff listened to the community's frustrations, asked for their solutions, and followed their lead. From this approach, a model of community mobilization emerged in Liberia that eased tensions, built trust, and eventually brought the epidemic under control. And if you look at the epi curve as when the Ebola outbreak starts to drop off, it's before the arrival of international aid. So it was really local community mobilization efforts that really started to turn on the outbreak. And once people you got to see signs like this, Ebola is real. And people, much like we saw in the context of COVID in the US. When I interviewed Fala in 2019, he had tears in his eyes as he recounted the outbreak. Ebola is not easy, he said. But as dark as Ebola was, it has given us a silver lining. That silver lining is the capacity to negotiate, the capacity to rebuild this country in research capacity that has never been seen before, he explained. Liberia's people, both living and dead, had given Liberia a resource, a virus. Follow and others were determined it would not be squandered. In exchange for aid to Liberia during the Ebola epidemic, the U.S. government demanded that all collected Ebola samples be sent to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the United States Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases is housed. Liberian public health experts like Fala and Liberia Institute of Biomedical Research Director Dr. Fatoma Bole were not content to watch a valuable resource be extracted from the country once again without adequate and preferably long-term benefits for its people. Together, Liberia's Ministry of Health and National Public Health Institute established jurisdictional control over the 16,000 blood, plasma, semen, urine, and oral swab samples collected from Liberians during the outbreak. The Liberian government's proprietary claims relied on a 2014 protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol on Access to Genetic Resources, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. It allows countries of origin to claim sovereignty over pathogens as a biological resource. Access to the Liberian samples, now housed in the United States, is controlled by a Liberian governance structure. Those seeking access must address how research, quote, will give Liberian opportunities to obtain advanced degrees or critical technology for the development of science and research for current and future generations of Liberia. So, for example, if a university like has happened, like Columbia University, wanted to access those samples to develop a quick Ebola assay kit, which they would then market. To be able to access those samples, they have to show a benefit sharing agreement, which is going to advance research capacity in Liberia, as well as the training of professionals in Liberia. So ENVIL has used its leverage to secure agreements with Western universities, government agencies, and biomedical firms to strengthen its public health surveillance and diagnostic facilities, and to help educate a new generation of Liberians in the study, treatment, and prevention of emerging infectious diseases. Fala insists, and I quote, "The blood of the innocent people deserves their efforts to make sure that every drop is used to benefit this country." Fala describes with great pride how, where once you saw white American faces conducting clinical vaccine trials in places like Monrovia's JFK Hospital, you now see only Liberian faces. Thus, a virus that emerged in the Upper Guinean forests of West Africa, devastating the region, has been mobilized by different actors to serve quite different ends. Conservation biologists seized upon Ebola's emergence and the associated fear to stigmatize bushmeat hunting in the name of biodiversity protection. Political ecologists employed the disease onslaught to critique the environmental and social impacts of industrial plantation agriculture sweeping across West Africa. Liberians have claimed sovereignty over the virus, attempting to overturn parasitic relations of exchange that have long plagued the country. These different sets of power and ecological relations all flow from and shape the actions of a virus in a multi-species world. In fall 2020, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, National Geographic released Virus Hunters, a flashy TV episode that follows ABC News correspondent James Longman and Harvard epidemiologist Chris Golden around the globe to, quote, the front lines of viral research, to hotspots where viruses are known to have emerged and where one could likely emerge again. Their first stop is an unnamed location in Liberia, but it's one I know well. Here we meet the charismatic American virus hunter and veterinarian, Jim Desmond, who, with his Liberian Predict EcoHealth Alliance team, donned personal protection suits to collect and sample bats. As the team prepares to enter the so-called cave where Ebola was so-called found, Longman anxiously asked Desmond, "Is Ebola still in there? Is it still out here?" Desmond replies, "Probably." Just 1 year after WHO declared the outbreak over in 2017, the steel manufacturing giant ArcelorMittal orchestrated a large translocation of bats living in an old mining gallery. The project was a purported act of care meant to ensure the survival of rare endemic species, as the company planned to extend open cast mining to a new peak in the Mount Nimba range of Liberia, which borders the Mount Nimba Strict Nature Reserve in Guinea, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and biodiversity hotspot. So these bats were living, when mining companies are exploring for ore, they dig what are called adits. So they dig into the mountain to try and find the ore content. And so there had been previously, from 1960 to 1990, this area had been mined by a Swedish mining company, Lamco. And then they left during the war years. ArcelorMittal took over the old concession, and they wanted to mine this new mountain where one of these adits was, but the adits had been repopulated by bats. And so in order to claim a biodiversity a mitigation strategy, they captured these bats and moved them onto the East Nimba Nature Reserve, which is a protected park, and they built an artificial cave to house them. Hotspots of biodiversity and tales of emerging infectious disease meet in this extracted zone, where the interests of mining and biodiversity conservation converge. So when they were doing this translocation, the environmental manager of ArcelorMittal had heard bats could be carriers of Ebola. And it happened that Desmond's team was in the region sampling wildlife for viruses. They offered their services to help minimize the risk of moving potentially disease-carrying bats. ArcelorMittal provided the necessary infrastructure to carry out the work of more than 2,000 bats at dusk. Before releasing them, the team collected blood and swabbed the orifices of these bats, searching for the elusive origins of Ebola. In 2019, Desmond's team, in collaboration with researchers from Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, publicly announced the isolation of an RNA fragment of Zaire Ebola virus from one of the blood samples taken from a great long-fingered bat. It was the first time Zaire Ebola virus was supposedly found in a bat in West Africa. Now, the EcoHealth Alliance Columbia University findings have yet to be published. And the finding of this fragment of Ebola Zaire virus and the affinity of bats for abandoned mining galleries have required a kind of disputed evidentiary value in efforts to make Mount Nimba a disease hotspot. Who is to blame is deeply contested among conservation NGOs, mining companies, and local people. Habitat fragmentation figures prominently in expert accounts of the causal drivers that spark Ebola outbreaks. They mobilize microbiological evidence, satellite data, and ideas about causality to incriminate different types of land use in critiques of deforestation. As the environmental manager of a nearby mining company told us, and I quote, "If this theory of forest fragmentation holds, then of course mining can open a corridor for contact, but so can slash and burn agriculture. Mining companies have used associations between bats, viruses, and zoonosis to lay blame on local slash and burn agriculture and manufacture doubt about the environmental harm caused by their own habitat destruction. Fragments of forests like the Nimba region near the Liberia-Guinea border are transformed by origin stories that turn locales into hotspots. In the Nat Geo episode, red spots light up across West and Central Africa, like eruptions along a volcanic archipelago, depicting Ebola's history on the African continent and transforming places like the Upper Guinean forests of West Africa into global objects of Western fear, attention, and concern. Red symbolizing heat, danger, and threat heightens the drama. But in these kinds of hotspot visualizations, scale is obscured. A red spot masks that the Nimba region, with its single Ebola virus RNA fragment, is 150 miles from Meliandu, where allegedly a bat and a boy began an outbreak. But scales of time and space affect both how ecological fables of disease are told and the futures that are made possible in their telling. The stories we tell build worlds. Zoonoses like Ebola are wicked problems. They can be approached from a variety of seemingly incompatible perspectives on the complex and multiscalar interactions between ecological and economic systems that generate them. Narratives woven around such wicked problems mobilize contextual facts and values to circumvent uncertainties. They point to responsibilities in ways that shape intervention policies. Ecological fables differentially foreground aspects of complex socio-ecological relations that create conditions of possibility for zoonoses to spread. Depending on where power lies, some come to stick, while others are excluded and repressed. Zoonoses and the ecologies of blame in which they are enmeshed offer, as I suggest in this talk, an opportunity to explore changing socio-ecological relationships, land governance, and the circulation of capital that are rapidly transforming places like the Upper Guinean forests of West Africa and other places on Earth. Thank you.